The text message arrived late on a Saturday, late May 2024. Quinn's mother, please don't attend the picnic. I'm certain you'd dampen the atmosphere. Seeing that casual rejection from Davis Sterling, 32, validated by likes from my daughter, Quinn Beaumont, 28, was a sharp sting for Lydia Beaumont. 54. Decades of devotion meant nothing against his need for dominance. But that arrogance was his fatal error. He'd never guessed that for 6 months he'd been employed by me. My holding company, Onyx Vantage Holdings, had discreetly purchased Cardinal Fleet Motors. His termination, already planned due to documented unprofessional behavior, was instantly moved up. Tomorrow, the routine review would take place in my corner office high up in the Atherton Tower. He was about to find out exactly who he had sought to sideline. A corner office, high up in the Atherton Tower, was designed to emphasize control and altitude. The walls were a pale, polished granite that absorbed sound, leaving only the hum of the city far below and the faint click of my keyboard. I, Lydia Beaumont, 54, with my silvery blonde hair pulled back tightly and wearing a slatter-grey suit tailored for precision, sat behind a massive desk of black steel and glass. I felt less like a mother preparing for a difficult conversation and more like a general deploying the final phase of a complex military operation. My focus wasn't on the panoramic view stretching out over the financial district, but on the sleek black tablet in front of me, which held the digital documentation file, the dossier. 6 months of meticulous surveillance, compiled by my team at Onyx Vantage Holdings, detailing every professional misstep, every violated policy, and every act of documented disrespect from Davis Sterling, 32. He was due to arrive any moment for what he believed was a high-stakes meeting with the new corporate ownership group, a meeting he had assured Quinn, 28, would secure his long-awaited promotion. The decision to accelerate the timeline had been purely professional, yet rooted in a deeply personal offense. That casual text message, the one dismissing me as a dampening atmosphere, had solidified his character assessment. It was the arrogance of a man who believed his superficial charm and manufactured confidence were sufficient to navigate life, especially when dealing with women he perceived as inferior or inconvenient. A discreet chime sounded from the security console. Davis and Quinn were in the lobby. "Send them up," I instructed my executive assistant, Maria, without looking up. I waited, allowing the silence to build pressure. When the heavy oak doors opened, the contrast between the two figures standing there was immediate. Davis, with his brown hair slicked back and wearing a suit that was perhaps a size too tight across the shoulders, entered first, his chest puffed out with an air of practiced entitlement. He was trying to project the image of the successful, upwardly mobile executive. Beside him, Quinn, with her wavy auburn hair, looked apprehensive, gripping her handbag tightly. She hadn't been informed of the nature of the meeting, only that Davis felt it was crucial for her to be present to demonstrate his stable family support. Davis stopped short, his confident stride faltering as he saw me. His eyes, darting around the minimalist, untouchable office, registered the power inherent in the space before landing on my face. The nervous perspiration I knew was characteristic of him was already beginning to bead faintly on his temples. "Lydia, what are you doing here?" Davis managed, the forced smile freezing on his face. Quinn, meanwhile, simply stared, her expression shifting from confusion to immediate concern. I stood, smoothing the jacket of my suit. My voice, when I spoke, was low, even, and entirely devoid of the warmth he had grown accustomed to manipulating. "Please sit down, Davis, Quinn. I'm glad you could join us." He still hadn't connected the dots. The name of my holding company, Onyx Vantage Holdings, was a recognized titan in the financial district, but it operated entirely outside the retail scope of a struggling suburban dealership like Cardinal Fleet Motors. That was the genius of the strategy, keeping the true ownership structure opaque until the necessary moment of impact. I didn't sit immediately. I walked slowly to the expansive window, my back momentarily to them, gazing out at the grid of the city, savoring the moment of clarity before the execution. Davis laughed nervously, a short, sharp bark that sounded strained in the silent office. "Lydia, come on! I know you've done well for yourself, but Onyx Vantage, that's a multi-billion-dollar firm. I think you have the wrong office." I returned to my chair, placing my hands flat on the cold glass desk surface. My blue eyes met his, piercing through the thin veneer of his bravado. 6 months ago, Davis Onyx Vantage Holdings discreetly acquired the distressed assets of Cardinal Fleet Motors. It was a portfolio diversification strategy, which means for the last 6 months, every paycheck you cashed, every commission you earned came directly from my company. The surgical force of the revelation was exactly as intended. Davis's face went white, the blood draining instantly. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut mid-performance. Quinn gasped, a small, choked sound, her gaze flickering rapidly between me and her husband. "No," Davis whispered, shaking his head. "That's impossible. Why didn't anyone tell you?" I finished smoothly. "Because your performance was already flagged for gradual termination. We needed a quiet observation period to gather actionable intelligence regarding management inefficiencies and employee conduct. You, Davis, were the perfect case study." I picked up the tablet. The screen displayed the title, Sterling Davis, Termination Review, Project Nightingale. "This meeting was scheduled as a routine performance review, yes," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "But yesterday, you provided me with a highly motivating reason to accelerate that timeline." The text message thread, Davis. "That casual, dismissive rejection of my presence at a family event. You sought to sideline the woman you perceived as a known entity, an inconvenient mother-in-law. You failed to realize you were attempting to diminish your employer." His composure completely fractured. The nervous perspiration now looked like a cold sweat. He leaned forward, desperate to regain control of the narrative, especially in front of Quinn. "This is retaliation," he spluttered. "You're using your power to settle a personal vendetta." "So I'll call my lawyer." "Retaliation requires a pretext, Davis," I countered, tapping the screen lightly. "I prefer accountability backed by data. Let's examine the facts. I didn't need a projector." The weight of the digital evidence was enough. I swiveled the tablet slightly so Quinn, who was now utterly still and watching with horrified fascination, could also see the summary screens. Davis stammered, trying to interrupt. "The market is soft. Everyone struggles. These are just petty grievances." I scrolled to an attached document. Specifically, an email chain from March 14th, where you referred to Ms. Helen Choi, the Director of Finance, as the clipboard drone who needs to stay in her lane, and 2 documented verbal warnings regarding your refusal to comply with diversity training requirements. The color returned to Davis's face, but only as a flush of profound, impotent rage. He turned to Quinn, seeking refuge in the domestic sphere he usually controlled. "Quinn, tell her. This is fabricated. She's trying to ruin me because I told her she couldn't come to the picnic. This is exactly how she operates. She micromanages. She controls everything." Quinn didn't speak. She didn't defend him. She looked at the tablet, then at Davis, then back at me. I could see the mechanism of manipulation finally grinding to a halt in her mind. The professional incompetence mirrored the personal behavior she had been excusing for years, the constant need to belittle her independence, the isolation from my support, the systematic chipping away at her self-worth, all under the guise of protecting their little family unit. He was failing professionally and compensating by establishing dominance at home. "This isn't fabricated, Davis," Quinn finally said, her voice shaking slightly, but steadying quickly. "Lydia doesn't need to fabricate anything. She uses evidence." That single statement was the true turning point. Not the firing, but Quinn's refusal to fall into his emotional trap. I watched Davis collapse back into the chair, realizing the depth of his isolation. Effective immediately, Davis Sterling, your employment with Cardinal Fleet Motors, an entity of Onyx Vantage Holdings, is terminated for cause. Effective immediately, I announced, rising again. You will be escorted out. Your severance will consist solely of your accrued vacation pay, less the cost of the property damage claim filed by the client whose car you keyed last month, which, yes, is also in the dossier. I suggest you contact a labor attorney. They will confirm that this documentation is airtight. The exit was ugly, swift, and entirely predictable. Davis, spitting threats and claiming political sabotage, was met by two large, quiet security personnel who appeared immediately at the doors. He was desperate, scrambling for his phone, yelling about his rights. He tried one last venomous attempt at personal injury. You think this is over, Lydia? You just made a huge mistake. You'll regret crossing me. I merely watched him being led away, my expression unmoved. Unlikely, Davis. The only mistake made today was yours. When the doors closed, a heavy silence fell again. Quinn remained seated, tears tracking paths down her face, not of sadness, but of stunned clarity. It was all real, she whispered. The incompetence, the disrespect. He always made it sound like the company was persecuting him. He said they didn't understand his aggressive sales style. He said I was being dramatic when I suggested he was unprofessional. He was isolating you, Quinn, I confirmed, walking over to her. I didn't offer a hug. This was a moment for hard truth, not soft comfort. Control takes many forms. Sometimes it's a dismissive text message in a family thread. Sometimes it's convincing you that your supportive parent is a threat to his authority. He needed to be the hero, the provider, the victim, anything but accountable. Quinn wiped her eyes, and when she looked up, the apprehension in her posture was replaced by a rigid, nascent strength, the core integrity Davis had tried so hard to bury. What happens now? She asked. Not about Davis, but about herself. Now, you decide what accountability means for your future, I replied. You saw the evidence. He showed you who he is, professionally and personally. You have a path forward. The subsequent months of summer 2024 were dominated by the inevitable legal fallout. Davis, fueled by a mixture of entitlement and genuine panic, filed the promised frivolous wrongful termination lawsuit against Onyx Vantage Holdings. He claimed age discrimination laughable, given my own age, gender discrimination richly ironic, and most emphatically, retaliation for the family disagreement. His attempt at personal harassment followed a similar pattern: veiled threats, aggressive texts, and attempts to leverage the ongoing divorce proceedings to extract financial concessions. He underestimated the infrastructure I had built to handle precisely this type of calculated legal aggression. The judge didn't just dismiss the claim. The ruling included a pointed commentary on the plaintiff's evident pattern of professional misconduct and disrespect toward women in positions of authority, a pattern the documentation clearly showed extended beyond his tenure at Cardinal Fleet Motors and was indicative of a career-long issue. Davis was ordered to cover a substantial portion of our legal fees. It was a clean, final legal sweep. Meanwhile, Quinn moved through the divorce with a focused determination I hadn't seen in her since she left college. The process was painful, but the realization of the systemic manipulation acted as an armor. She used the professional evidence I had provided to counter his attempts at financial and emotional leverage. The isolation he had enforced was replaced by an intense reconnection with me. Though our relationship remained fundamentally professionalized by the experience, Quinn didn't rush into a new career. She needed to process the reality of her ex-husband's true character. But she started attending industry lectures with me, observing meetings at Onyx Vantage Holdings, absorbing the atmosphere of strategic execution and uncompromising standards. One afternoon, as we were reviewing the restructuring plan for the dealership, now rebranded and rapidly improving, Quinn articulated a vision that went far beyond mere corporate cleanup. The failure wasn't just Davis's incompetence, she said, looking over the demographic reports. It was the environment that allowed him to thrive on disrespect. So many women in that dealership in his life, they let small things slide because they didn't have the data, the backing, or the belief that they could hold someone like him accountable without being labeled dramatic or vengeful. She pitched the idea to me in my office, the very room where Davis had been terminated. She was no longer the hesitant woman from that May afternoon. Her wavy auburn hair was styled with confidence, her gaze sharp, reflecting the focus she had found. We should create a dedicated division within Unbeknownst Vantage, she proposed. Not just for mentorship, but for structural support. We need to fund and empower women-owned businesses that prioritize accountability and transparency. We can use our corporate infrastructure, the same forensic review processes we used on Davis, to ensure ethical leadership. We need to show that manipulation and mediocrity, especially when targeted at undermining women, are no longer viable career strategies. I listened, stoic as always, but deeply impressed. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking systemic change, turning her trauma into policy. "What do you call this division?" I asked. "The Women's Business Development Division," Quinn replied instantly. "It's about turning the pain of recognizing control tactics into a thriving, empowered enterprise." I didn't hesitate. "Prepare the proposal. We'll give you the capital and the mandate." By 2027, the Women's Business Development Division was not merely successful, it was transformative. Quinn, now 31, led the division with a fierce, loyal determination. She channeled the devastating lessons learned from Davis's systematic deception into a blueprint for ethical business practice. The division had become a major contributor to Unbeknownst Vantage's portfolio, investing in dozens of femoral startups, demanding high standards of corporate conduct, and, critically, providing resources for women dealing with workplace hostility or gendered manipulation. The irony was sharp, yet deeply satisfying. Davis Sterling's attempt to diminish me, to reduce my decades of success to a mere dampening atmosphere that should be excluded, had inadvertently sparked the creation of an entity far greater than himself or his meager career. His need to establish dominance had only inspired the establishment of genuine empowerment. My work often involves looking forward, analyzing risks, and optimizing returns. But sometimes, I allow myself a brief glance back at the chain of events that led us here. I think of the quiet triumph in the courtroom, the surgical precision of the dossier, and most importantly, the profound transformation in Quinn. She took the trauma of realization and forged it into a steel-sharp mission. Davis, I hear, still struggles to hold down a job, often blaming past corporate conspiracies for his lack of success. Forever trapped in the cycle of blaming others rather than facing his own documented failures. He is irrelevant, a footnote in the narrative of Unbeknownst Vantage Holdings. The Atherton Tower office remains my command center. Today, Quinn often sits across from me, not as my daughter seeking advice, but as a trusted executive, discussing seven-figure investment strategies. The silent space that once witnessed Davis's downfall now hosts the architects of a future where accountability is non-negotiable. And the strategic underestimation of a woman in power is the most costly error a person can make. I smile sometimes, just slightly, recognizing that the greatest victory wasn't the termination. It was watching Quinn find her own unassailable power. If you found the detailed strategy and ultimate transformation in this story compelling, please make sure to subscribe and like. Your support helps us tell more stories about strategic clarity and uncompromising accountability. The heavy oak doors of the Atherton Tower office had barely sealed behind the security personnel and Davis. But the reverberations of his pathetic, entitled outburst still seemed to hang in the rarefied air. I remained standing, my gaze fixed on the doors for a moment longer, allowing myself the cold satisfaction of finality. Davis Sterling, 32 years old, was now officially and irrevocably outside the structure of my control. He was merely an incident report. I turned back to Quinn Beaumont, 28 years old, who was slumped slightly in the pristine white leather chair, the low glass table separating us now feeling like an enormous gulf. Her wavy auburn hair had fallen across her face, obscuring the precise look in her eyes, but her hands, gripping the edge of the chair, were trembling visibly. This was the harder part. The professional execution was clean. The emotional fallout was messy and strictly familial. I walked slowly back toward the desk, but instead of sitting, I moved to the side of the seating area, positioning myself slightly above her, maintaining the posture of mentorship and authority, not motherly comfort. "It was necessary, Quinn," I said, my voice cutting through the lingering tension. I offered no qualifiers, no softening apologies for the surgical bluntness of the termination. Truth was the only antiseptic strong enough for this wound. Quinn finally looked up. Her eyes were red, not from grief over Davis, but from the shock of radical disillusionment. She looked utterly lost, seeing the world, and her marriage, stripped bare of the comfortable lies Davis had woven. "He always said I was paranoid," she whispered, her voice husky. "Every time I questioned the company culture, or asked why he missed quotas or why Miss Choi was suddenly transferred, he twisted it. He made me feel like I was the dramatic one, that I didn't support his career. He painted the whole world as against him." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "He even made me feel guilty for talking to you, Lydia. Said you were toxic and overbearing, that you were trying to control our finances." I nodded, acknowledging the familiar pattern. That is how manipulation works, Quinn. It establishes an alternate reality where the abuser is the victim, and any supportive voice outside the unit is the enemy. It's systematic isolation, designed to ensure you only trust his narrative. I picked up the dossier, the sleek black tablet that held his ruin. It was no longer a tool of corporate strategy. It was the ultimate forensic record of his character. "Look at this documentation, Quinn," I continued, holding it out slightly. "He wasn't failing because the market was soft. He was failing because he was lazy, dishonest, and incapable of respecting authority, particularly female authority. His professional incompetence required a constant narrative of external persecution to sustain his self-image. That narrative became the blueprint for how he treated you." She didn't take the tablet but stared at the screen title, Sterling Davis, Termination Review, Project Nightingale. "He said the text message, the one about dampening the atmosphere, was just a joke," Quinn recounted, her gaze distant. "He said he was trying to protect me from the stress of family dynamics." Jokes are meant to be funny, Quinn. That text was a declaration of ownership. He publicly reduced me, the mother who raised you, to an inconvenience, a distraction from his projected perfect life. He needed that public validation of dominance from the family group chat because he was internally failing so spectacularly. That text was the corporate equivalent of an immediate and aggressive policy violation. The clinical explanation seemed to ground her, replacing the emotional turmoil with structured understanding. This was the language she was raised in, the language of strategy and consequences. "He used me as a shield," she concluded, the realization dawning fully. "He brought me here today, didn't he? To show Onyx Vantage that he had the stable family unit, the supportive wife, the respectable facade. He was trying to impress you with his personal life, not knowing you already knew every failure of his professional one." "Precisely. And that attempt at leveraging domesticity for corporate gain was the final miscalculation," I confirmed. "He underestimated the price of public disrespect. The termination was planned, but the accelerated timeline, that was personal accountability." I gave her a few minutes of necessary silence. The cityscape outside the Atherton Tower windows remained vibrant and indifferent. When she finally pushed herself up from the chair, her posture, though weary, was visibly straighter. "I need to go home, Lydia," she said, her voice firmer now. "I need to look at everything in that apartment and decide what belongs to him and what belongs to me. Do not worry about the logistics of his departure or the inevitable legal backlash, I instructed. Onyx Vantage handles the termination protocol with precision. He will be provided a secure channel for his personal belongings and legal counsel. Your focus must be the structural dismantling of your marriage. Do it with the same surgical clarity we just applied here. She simply nodded, met my gaze, and for the first time in years, I saw the unadulterated strength I knew she possessed, the strength that Davis had tried to systematically suppress. The immediate aftermath, throughout summer 2024, was less a period of quiet recovery and more a declaration of war. Davis Sterling was ill-equipped to fight, much less win. True to form, less than 2 weeks after his termination, the legal notifications arrived. Davis filed a massive wrongful termination suit against Onyx Vantage Holdings and, explicitly naming me, Lydia Beaumont, claiming retaliation rooted in personal malice and age discrimination, citing my involvement in his daughter's life as proof of undue influence and vendetta. The irony was not lost on my legal team or on me. A man whose documented career was characterized by profound disrespect toward women in management was now claiming discrimination. His audacity, fueled by panic and entitlement, was staggering. We let him posture in the press releases his shoddy labor attorney issued. They attempted to spin the narrative, painting Davis as the victim of a corporate giant leveraging its power to settle a petty family grievance involving a misunderstood text message. They even tried to paint Cardinal Fleet Motors as a failing business, unfairly blaming its hardworking employees. I met with my chief counsel, Jonathan Wells, a man who had guided Onyx Vantage through dozens of complex hostile takeovers and litigation battles. He was entirely unfazed by Davis's threats. He's using the scorned mother-in-law trope, Lydia, Jonathan stated during our review in the Atherton Tower office. It's lazy lawyering designed for media noise, not judicial efficacy. I merely placed the dossier on the table. The tablet now looked almost radioactive in its capacity to destroy a life built on Sasa. I want the counterfiling to be exhaustive, Jonathan. No details too small. I want to demonstrate that his unprofessional conduct was not merely a matter of poor sales, but a systemic pattern of ethical and professional misconduct that long predated the alleged retaliation event. I want his counsel to understand that they are not dealing with a family spat, but a highly documented corporate failure. The legal discovery process we initiated was relentless. While Davis and his attorney attempted to gather flimsy evidence of our conspiracy, we simply presented the facts. The digital documentation file was the core of our defense. It contained 6 months of aggregated data. 1. Sales metrics, not just the raw low numbers, but side-by-side comparisons showing how Davis's performance dropped immediately following every diversity training module or management change that introduced stricter accountability. 4. Property damage claim. The details of the client's keyed car, initially settled internally by the struggling dealership, were brought back to the surface, complete with the mechanic's report and the client's initial sworn complaint. We filed a motion for summary judgment arguing that no reasonable jury could find in favor of Davis, given the irrefutable volume and quality of the documentation detailing his misconduct. Davis attempted personal harassment concurrently with the lawsuit. He tried to flood Quinn's phone with desperate, manipulative messages, sometimes threatening, sometimes tearful pleas, always seeking to regain control by destabilizing her emotionally. He used the divorce proceedings to try and extract an absurd financial settlement, leveraging Quinn's emotional history against her. But Quinn was protected, not just by my legal team, but by the cold clarity the dossier had afforded her. She understood that his emotional swings were just another tactic, a desperate extension of the manipulation she had witnessed in my office. "He's trying to bankrupt me into submission, Lydia," she told me over coffee one afternoon, her voice entirely flat, devoid of emotion, focused purely on the problem. "He knows I don't have Onyx Vantage's capital. He thinks if he drags out the divorce, I'll fold. He is testing your resolve, Quinn. He thrives on finding the emotional weak point," I countered. "But we have given you the armor of objective truth. use the same methodology against his personal claims that were used against his professional ones. And she did. Quinn, guided by her own newly hired divorce attorney, who worked closely with Jonathan Welsby again, systematically cataloguing every financial manipulation, every attempt at emotional coercion, and every instance of isolation Davis had employed during their marriage. The mirroring of his professional failures and his personal control tactics became undeniable. The final legal showdown in the civil court was anticlimactic for us, yet devastating for Davis. He arrived at the hearing looking strained, still trying to project an air of injured confidence, but the sweat on his brow was immediate and profound. He still seemed to believe that the court would recognize the injustice of a rich mother-in-law ruining her son-in-law. When our legal team began presenting the evidence during the discovery hearing, Davis's facade crumbled in real time. The judge, a woman known for her strict adherence to procedural fairness, did not tolerate the media theatrics or the weak legal arguments. When Davis's attorney attempted to argue the retaliation angle based on the text message thread, the judge cut him off sharply. "Counselor," the judge stated, her voice severe, "the evidence presented here suggests a pattern of egregious professional failure and documented misconduct. That spans well over 6 months. Even if there were a personal disagreement between your client and Ms. Beaumont, the documentation provided by Onyx Vantage Holdings provides independent, irrefutable grounds for immediate termination for cause. Furthermore, the documented disrespect toward multiple female colleagues and managers suggests a pervasive issue that has no bearing on this family conflict." She didn't just dismiss the case. The ruling was a scathing indictment. The summary judgment was granted in our favor, and, critically, Davis Sterling was ordered to cover a substantial portion of Onyx Vantage's extensive legal fees. It was a final, complete legal dismantling. Davis had tried to use the court system as a weapon, and it had been turned against him, the full weight of his failures laid bare in a public forum. The court had recognized the career-long pattern of misogyny, disguised as aggressive sales. With the lawsuit settled and the divorce proceedings moving toward an equitable, though slow, conclusion, the intense pressure that had defined summer 2024 began to lift. Quinn, having watched her exhausband's entire foundation collapse under the weight of documented truth, was undergoing a profound transformation. The initial shock gave way to a cold, focused anger, not destructive rage, but a strategic fire. She stopped seeing Davis as a complex relationship problem and started seeing him as a case study in failed accountability. She moved into a small, elegant apartment near the financial district, closer to me and the professional world I inhabited. She didn't seek a job immediately. Instead, she immersed herself in learning the mechanisms of the financial ecosystem that had just saved her. She started attending executive meetings at Onyx Vantage Holdings, sitting in on strategy sessions, not as an employee, but as an observer under my mentorship. She witnessed how decisions were made, how data trumped emotion, how ethical compliance was factored into profitability, and how the firm valued sharp, uncompromised execution. She asked questions that were far more penetrating than simple curiosity. She wanted to know how Onyx Vantage identified struggling businesses, what governance structures were put in place during turnarounds, and most importantly, how we built internal cultures that actively deterred and penalized misconduct like Davis's. One rainy October afternoon, Quinn and I were reviewing the restructuring documents for Cardinal Fleet Motors. The dealership was being completely gutted, rebranded, and relaunched with a strict zero-tolerance policy for high-pressure sales and gendered language. The new management team, led by a highly competent woman from outside the industry, was already seeing massive cultural and revenue improvements. Quinn leaned back in the chair in my office, tapping a finger on a demographic report that detailed the gender ratio and satisfaction scores among the dealership staff. "We fixed the business model, Lydia, and we removed the malignant element," Quinn started, her tone analytical, almost detached. "But what about the environment that allowed him to exist for so long? The other dealerships, the other corporate structures, they're full of men like Davis. Mediocrity, protected by ego, where female employees and clients have to constantly manage their expectations of respect. She stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the vast, intricate network of the city below. I realized the trauma wasn't just in being manipulated, but in the realization that so many women are conditioned to accept that manipulation, both professional and personal, as a cost of doing business or a cost of maintaining peace. They are told they are being dramatic when they point out a professional slight or an ethical violation. She turned back to me, the hesitancy entirely gone, replaced by the conviction of someone who has found their calling. Onyx Vantage is about identifying opportunity in distress. And there is a massive opportunity to support ethical leadership, especially female leadership. Where this kind of systemic disrespect is actively stamped out, Quinn proposed. I listened, silently observing the fire in her eyes. This was not the daughter I had worried about. This was the executive she was meant to be. We need to create a dedicated investment vehicle within Onyx Vantage Holdings, she continued, articulating her thoughts with impressive clarity. A division focused on funding, advising, and scaling businesses that are majority women-owned or that demonstrate exceptional, measurable commitments to accountability, ethical workplace standards, and the dismantling of these old boy networks. We need to actively apply the forensic scrutiny of the dossier not to find failure, but to guarantee success built on integrity. You are proposing a strategic venture fund, but with a cultural mandate, I summarized, my lips barely curving into a faint smile. Exactly. We can use the data. We can leverage our infrastructure. We can turn the pain of recognizing control tactics into the engine for a thriving, empowered enterprise. We call it the Women's Business Development Division. It's a direct response to the complacency that allowed a man like Davis to thrive and fail. She had analyzed the corporate failure, processed the personal betrayal, and synthesized it into a scalable business solution. It was the purest form of strategic execution. I didn't need a feasibility report. I needed a charter. Prepare the proposal, Quinn. Define the parameters, the ethical benchmarks, and the funding targets. I will provide the capital, the mandate, and the full backing of Onyx Vantage Holdings. The years moved swiftly. By 2027, the Women's Business Development Division was the most dynamic and rapidly expanding wing of Onyx Vantage. Quinn, now 31, was its fierce and formidable leader. Her office was only 2 floors below mine in the Atherton Tower. A deliberate proximity that underscored her executive status and our partnership. Quinn herself had developed a formidable reputation. She spoke at industry conferences, articulating the connection between poor governance and personal entitlement. She had taken the specific pain of realizing her husband was systematically lying about his professional life and used it to build a global framework designed to prevent other women from experiencing similar disillusionment and professional sabotage. We often sat together in my corner office, reviewing potential acquisitions or discussing strategy. It was a relationship built on mutual respect and shared strategic vision. Far stronger than the conventional mother-daughter dynamic. We closed the deal on Athena Robotics today, Lydia, Quinn announced one late afternoon. Leaning across the glass desk, her face illuminated by the city lights. It's a 7-figure investment. Female-founded, entirely transparent supply chain, and an internal mentorship program that's unparalleled. Excellent return projection, Quinn, I noted, glancing at the figures she presented. More than just a return, Mother. It's validation, she countered, smiling slightly. Athena Robotics hired Helen Choi, the former finance director at Cardinal Fleet Motors. She left after Davis tried to undermine her in 2024. She told me today that she feels like she can finally work in an environment where her competence is the only thing that matters, not having to constantly defend her authority. That was the core victory. Not the termination, but the restorative impact on the victims of Davis's systemic disrespect. I allowed myself a moment of profound reflection. Davis Sterling's attempt to diminish me, the casual text message, the effort to reduce my decades of strategic achievement to a dampening atmosphere, had been the single greatest strategic error of his life. It had unleashed not retaliation, but professional accountability backed by limitless resources, resulting in the creation of a powerful, ethical enterprise run by his ex-wife. I looked at Quinn, the woman who had walked into this office 3 years prior, shaken and confused, and who now commanded respect across the financial district. The true power was not in the corner office or the views from Atherton Tower, but in the clarity she had achieved. The most important lesson in business, Quinn, I mused, leaning back in my chair, watching the city glow, is that data always prevails over ego. Davis never understood that. His attempt to sideline the woman he perceived as inconvenient only inspired the creation of a system designed specifically to sideline men like him. The office, high above the humming city, felt purposeful. It was the command center of Onyx Vantage Holdings, where strategy was executed, and now where accountability was enshrined. The victory was comprehensive, absolute, and most importantly, systemic. If you found the detailed strategy and ultimate transformation in this story compelling, please make sure to subscribe and like. Your support helps us tell more stories about strategic clarity and uncompromising accountability. The Saturday evening in late May 2024 was perfectly quiet in my penthouse apartment. The kind of stillness that usually precedes a significant market correction or a personal catastrophe. I, Lydia Beaumont, 54, with my silvery blonde hair meticulously styled and dressed in tailored silk that evening, was reviewing preliminary data on an infrastructure acquisition, finding the technical details far more predictable than human behavior. My phone buzzed, resting face up on the polished mahogany table. It was the family group chat, a necessary, if often frivolous, appendage of modern life. The casual text, jarringly out of sync with the quiet rigor of my evening, flashed across the screen. "Lydia, please don't attend the picnic tomorrow. I'm certain you'd dampen the atmosphere." Was signed simply, Davis, Sterling 32, my son-in-law. I felt the familiar sharp intake of breath, not of injury but of pure cold disbelief. It wasn't just the message itself, the public dismissal, the implication that my presence, the presence of the woman who had single-handedly financed their mortgage down payment and paid for Quinn's expensive education, was equivalent to a structural defect. It was the immediate aftermath. One by one, little thumbs up and smiling face emojis appeared beneath his text. Quinn Beaumont, 28, my own daughter, had contributed a heart reaction. Davis's mother, of course, posted an enthusiastic "great idea." The realization hit with the force of an institutional betrayal. 25 years of devoted single motherhood, of unwavering financial and emotional support, meant nothing against Davis's fundamental need to establish dominance, to publicly reduce me to an inconvenient, dampening atmosphere. For precisely 60 seconds, I allowed the sting of that casual cruelty to resonate. Then the feeling dissolved entirely, replaced by the deep, resonant hum of strategic clarity. Davis's biggest mistake was not hurting my feelings. It was believing that he possessed the power to sideline me. He was entirely unaware that for the last 6 months, he had been working for me. My investment vehicle, Onyx Vantage Holdings, the name synonymous with untouchable power in the financial district, had discreetly purchased the struggling suburban dealership Cardinal Fleet Motors, where Davis was employed as a senior sales director. Our acquisition was part of a larger asset recovery project, and his entire department had been under silent, meticulous observation since the purchase closed in December. His termination timeline, originally planned as a gradual, professionally managed exit strategy due to his dismal performance, mounting customer complaints, and documented unprofessional behavior, especially concerning female colleagues and clients, was instantly accelerated. I picked up the phone, bypassing the family thread entirely. I called Jonathan Wells, my chief counsel, interrupting his Saturday evening. Jonathan, who knew the details of my personal life and Davis's corporate failures intimately, didn't ask for clarification. He simply confirmed, "Consider it done, Lydia. Prepare the dossier." The following morning, the Atherton Tower was quiet, reflecting the Sunday stillness of the financial district. The corner office on the 72nd floor of Onyx Vantage Holdings was bathed in the cool, blue-grey light of a pre-storm sky. The panoramic views of the city below offered a fitting backdrop to the impending surgical operation. I stood behind the expansive glass desk, wearing a charcoal power suit that felt less like clothing and more like armor. Scattered across the desk were physical printouts, meticulously categorized and tabbed, representing the digital documentation file, the dossier. It was 6 months of irrefutable, aggregated failure, now poised to be deployed with lethal efficiency. The heavy oak door opened and Davis Sterling walked in, followed closely by Quinn. Davis, slightly rumpled but trying to project confidence in his best-tailored suit, seemed entirely unaware of the execution awaiting him. He was prone to nervous perspiration, and I could already see a slight sheen on his brow despite the air conditioning. He had clearly brought Quinn along not for support, but as a visual proper display of the stable family man to impress the shadowy, new corporate management he thought he was meeting. He still saw every professional interaction as a performance where domesticity could be leveraged for career stability. Quinn stood slightly behind him, her wavy auburn hair pulled back tight, her posture already hesitant. She caught my eye. Lydia Beaumont, Quinn's mother, and offered a faint, confused nod. She was expecting a quick, intimidating meeting with a nameless corporate executive. Not a silent convergence of family and finance. I walked slowly from behind the desk, positioning myself directly in front of the window, allowing the morning light to frame my profile. "You won't be needing that," I gestured toward the expensive leather briefcase Davis clutched. "Please have a seat." He seemed confused by the formality, but obliged, pulling out a chair for Quinn before sitting himself. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Miss Beaumont," Davis started, a hint of his habitual entitlement creeping into his tone. "Is there a new restructuring? I thought this was a performance review." "It is," I confirmed. I moved to the desk and picked up the central tablet, the dossier holding it so the title was clearly visible to both of them. Sterling Davis, Termination Review, Cardinal Fleet Motors. The revelation hit them both with surgical force. Davis's face went instantly pale, the nervous sheen on his forehead becoming pronounced sweat. Quinn gasped, a small, choked sound that betrayed her total shock. She looked between me, her mother, the pillar of her security, and Davis, the man who had just publicly humiliated me and whose entire professional existence was apparently now controlled by me. Davis scrambled for words, his prepared air of professionalism vanishing. This is ridiculous. A conflict of interest. A vendetta. This is corporate malfeasance. It is meticulously documented accountability, I corrected him calmly. I tapped the tablet screen. 6 months ago, we instituted a new internal audit structure focused entirely on your department. We did this because we detected anomalies typical of self-serving, incompetent management. This is a side-by-side comparison of your sales metrics, Davis, versus the median performance of your colleagues, I narrated, pointing with precision. You consistently rank in the lowest quartile. Your failure is not due to market softness. It is due to laziness and profound inability to close deals ethically. You have a documented lead-to-conversion ratio of 4.2% in a target environment of 11%. These numbers are irrefutable. Davis tried to interrupt, waving his hand dismissively. Those figures are manipulated. The internal system is flawed. Everyone knows the new general manager. She's incompetent. The new general manager, Ms. Chun, happens to be an award-winning executive we brought in from Seattle, I stated flatly. But let's move past mere incompetence. Let's discuss your character. Davis, You have spent the last 6 months systematically attempting to undermine any female authority figure assigned to you. Here, the documented emails regarding Helen Choi, where you referred to her expertise as pedantic micromanagement. Here, the internal memo where you argued against implementing new diversity training because you claimed it would dilute the aggressive sales culture. I watched Quinn. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her previous confusion replaced by a dawning horror. She wasn't looking at corporate jargon. She was looking at evidence of the same underlying arrogance and disrespect she had experienced at home, now codified in data. You lied to Quinn, I continued, my voice gaining an edge of steel. You painted the world as against you. You told her Ms. Choi was incompetent, that the company culture was toxic, because you needed an external excuse for your internal failures. That narrative became the blueprint for how you treated her, systematically isolating her from supportive voices like mine and demanding emotional energy to sustain your failing self-image. Davis leaped from his chair, scattering a glass of water across the desk. This is personal retaliation because of the text message. This is a mother-in-law abusing corporate power. You hated me, and now you're using your wealth to destroy me. Sit down, Davis, I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous low. The security team standing silently by the door shifted slightly. He hesitated, but the sheer force of authority radiating from me pushed him back into his seat. Your text message, Davis, was indeed the catalyst for the accelerated timeline. That public declaration of contempt for your wife's mother, issued while you were demonstrably failing in your role, proved you lacked the necessary judgment and professional decorum to represent Onyx Vantage Holdings, even in a subsidiary role. Davis buried his face in his hands, muttering denials. He was utterly defeated. His carefully constructed facade of professional competence obliterated by the weight of digital evidence. He looked up, tears of pure, desperate rage and humiliation streaming down his face. You won't get away with this, Lydia. I will sue you. I will ruin your reputation. We anticipated that, I said, walking toward the door and opening it, signaling the 2 security personnel. And we are fully prepared. You have 6 months of irrefutable documentation against you. Good luck. As Davis was physically guided out, still shouting vague threats and accusations, Quinn remained seated. She hadn't moved since I revealed my ownership. She looked up at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terrible clarity. The texts, the late nights, the excuses, she whispered, her voice raw. It was all real. It wasn't just stress. He was failing. He was lying. All of it. The professional incompetence was a mirror, Quinn. I repeated the lesson I knew she needed to internalize. It was always a matter of character. This was the reckoning. The revelation had not just terminated a job. It had shattered her reality, forcing her to confront the systematic manipulation she had been living under. The man she loved was fundamentally dishonest, his need to control and isolate her a direct extension of his inability to manage his own career with integrity. The weeks that followed, throughout summer 2024, were a maelstrom of legal maneuvers and emotional fallout. Davis, true to his word, launched a furious counterattack, fueled by a mixture of entitlement and wounded pride. His legal notification arrived 10 days after his termination. A massive, sprawling wrongful termination suit against Onyx Vantage Holdings, explicitly naming me, Lydia Beaumont, as the orchestrator of a vindictive corporate conspiracy and personal vendetta, citing the infamous text message thread as prima facie evidence of my malice. His lawyer, a sharp, aggressive man known for ambulance-chasing labor cases, attempted to frame Davis as the victim of a petty family quarrel escalating into corporate abuse. I met with Jonathan Wells in the Atherton Tower, reviewing the filing. Jonathan, a man who viewed litigation as a chess game where the opponent's next 4 moves were always predictable, simply smiled thinly. "He's relying on public opinion, Lydia," Jonathan observed. tapping the section of the filing that highlighted the dampening the atmosphere text. He wants to play the rich mother-in-law against the hard-working common man trope. It's theatrics, not law. We will not engage in theatrics, Jonathan, I instructed. We will engage in forensic reality. I want the counterfiling to be exhaustive. Every instance of misconduct. Every logged manipulation. I want his attorney to understand that they are not debating a family disagreement. They are dealing with 6 months of unimpeachable, independently verified corporate data. Our strategy was simple: bypass the emotional argument entirely and present such a volume of factual, technical evidence that the judge would be forced to rule on merit, not emotion. We weren't just defending against his claim, we were prosecuting his career. The legal discovery process we initiated was brutal and one-sided. While Davis and his counsel tried to secure witnesses to testify about my alleged overbearing nature, we simply provided the dossier. The digital documentation file was deployed in full. We included 1. Sales deficiencies, not just the low numbers, but the detailed analysis showing Davis's complete inability to adapt to new, ethically mandated sales processes implemented by Onyx Vantage. 4. The pattern. We even successfully obtained documented performance reviews from his previous employers, demonstrating a career-long pattern of poor performance masked by aggressive posturing, frequently followed by complaints that management was too political or too feminine. The sheer, suffocating volume of evidence made his case untenable. Davis had spent years leaving a paper trail of misconduct, confident that he could charm or intimidate his way out of consequences. He failed to realize that Onyx Vantage specialized in finding and capitalizing on neglected paper trails. Concurrently, Davis attempted personal harassment against Quinn. He viewed her decision to initiate divorce proceedings as the ultimate betrayal, responding with a desperate barrage of manipulative texts and calls. They were a cycling loop of aggression, pleas for forgiveness, and threats of financial ruin, all aimed at destabilizing her and forcing her back into his control. But Quinn was armed with a clarity that few women ever achieve so rapidly. She had witnessed the methodical destruction of his professional facade in my office. She understood that his emotional swings were just another tactic, a predictable extension of the control he had lost. "He keeps telling me I'll be bankrupt if I leave him," Quinn told me one evening. Reviewing her financial separation documents in my office, her voice calm, almost detached. She looked through the financial spreadsheets with the same cool analysis I applied to balance sheets. He leveraged my loyalty, knowing I wouldn't question the joint accounts. But now I see it was never about protecting our wealth. It was about ensuring I couldn't leave without pain. "That is the cost of control, Quinn," I said. "He is testing your resolve. He is accustomed to operating in an environment professional and personal where women manage his emotions. Stop managing them. Document them." Quinn began applying the methodology of the dossier to her marriage. She catalogued every manipulative text, every unexplained financial depletion, every instance of isolation. The mirroring of his corporate fraud and his domestic control tactics became undeniable evidence in the divorce proceedings. The courtroom hearing for our motion for summary judgment arrived toward the end of the summer. Davis showed up looking visibly aged. His tailored suit now seemed to conceal less, and his bravado was paper-thin. He still believed that a single dramatic speech about the vindictive mother-in-law would sway the court. He was wrong. The judge, a highly respected woman named Judge Eleanor Vance, had zero tolerance for personal drama or media spin. When Jonathan Wells began presenting the digital documentation file, focusing strictly on the contractual and ethical failures, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from litigation to corporate audit. When Davis's counsel attempted to pivot, arguing that the true motive was the family conflict stemming from the text message thread, Judge Hayes cut him off with an icy finality. "Counselor," the judge stated, her voice resonating with authority, "Onyx Vantage Holdings has provided documentation of gross professional negligence, attempted financial fraud, and a documented pattern of disrespectful conduct towards subordinates and superiors that far predates the alleged retaliation event. The volume and quality of this evidence provide independent, irrefutable grounds for immediate termination for cause. Your argument regarding a familial spat is irrelevant to the matter of contractual employment violations. The ruling was swift, comprehensive, and utterly damning. Judge Hayes granted the motion for summary judgment, dismissing Davis Sterling's wrongful termination suit. To cement his failure, Davis was also ordered to cover a significant portion of Onyx Vantage's extensive legal fees, ensuring that his legal maneuvering cost him not just his job, but his remaining capital. It was the final public dismantling of his professional existence. He had sought validation through a lawsuit, and instead, the court had publicly affirmed that his failures were entirely his own doing, rooted in his persistent lack of integrity and disrespect for women in positions of power. With the lawsuit settled and the divorce proceedings progressing slowly but surely toward an equitable, non-negotiable conclusion, the intensity of the fight receded. Quinn was no longer consumed by crisis. She was focused on rebuilding using the intellectual tools I had provided her. She had lost the emotional energy that was once devoted to sustaining Davis's fragile ego and redirected it into furious, strategic self-education. She didn't mourn the marriage. She analyzed the failure. She moved into a sleek, smaller apartment overlooking Central Park, symbolically closer to the rigorous world of the financial district and the Onyx Vantage headquarters. She spent the next several months absorbing knowledge. She attended executive seminars, she audited finance courses online, and most critically, she began shadowing me at Onyx Vantage Holdings. She sat in the enormous, sterile conference rooms, watching how multi-million-dollar decisions were executed. She observed the ruthless efficiency of our acquisition strategies, the emphasis on data over emotion, and the stringent ethical compliance structures we enforced in our subsidiary structures that had ultimately caught Davis. Quinn was driven by a single, focused anger, not vengeance against Davis, but rage against the systemic complacency that allowed men like him to thrive for so long, protected by institutional reluctance to enforce strict ethical accountability, especially when dealing with documented misogyny disguised as aggressive sales. One rainy October afternoon, as we reviewed the comprehensive rebranding plan for Cardinal Fleet Motors, now stripped of its former toxicity and renamed Phoenix Automotive Solutions, Quinn laid out her vision. We cleaned up the dealership, Lydia. We removed the toxic element, replaced the management, and instituted zero-tolerance policies, Quinn stated, her finger tracing a projected revenue growth chart. But what about the thousands of other struggling companies, or the newly founded ones, where this same dynamic is at play? Where women are constantly having to manage or absorb or ignore the arrogance and entitlement of mediocre men? She stood up, her movement precise and intentional. She looked nothing like the hesitant woman who had walked into the Atherton Tower that May morning. She had the focused gaze of a newly minted strategist. The greatest distress signal in the market, beyond financial reports, is ethical failure, she argued. Walking to the window, and we have the perfect forensic toolkit. We know how to detect systemic lies, how to document manipulation, and how to hold leaders accountable. We used the dossier to destroy Davis's career. Now we should use that same rigor to build ethical careers and enterprises. She turned back to me, conviction hardening her features. I propose we create a dedicated investment and development vehicle within Onyx Vantage, a division focused entirely on funding and scaling businesses that are majority women-owned, or that demonstrate exceptional, measurable commitments to accountability and integrity in the workplace. We use our data analytics to proactively weed out the potential Davises and champion the leadership that is consistently undervalued because it refuses to participate in the old boy ego networks. It was not a request for a job. It was a proposal for a major new wing of the corporation, derived directly from the failure of her marriage and the resulting corporate execution. She had transformed humiliation into a comprehensive business model. I did not hesitate. Define the mandate, Quinn. Write the charter. I will provide the seed capital, the full infrastructure, and the direct executive oversight you require. Quinn's reputation had become formidable. She spoke at global financial summits, articulating the direct correlation between poor governance, entitled male mediocrity, and diminished profitability. She had taken the excruciating lesson of recognizing her own isolation and turned it into a methodology for global empowerment. Athena Robotics just secured the second round of funding, Lydia Quinn announced one crisp afternoon, setting a tablet on the desk. Their valuation has exceeded expectations by 40%. More importantly, their internal ethical review scores are perfect. Excellent returns, Quinn, I replied, nodding at the figures. That was the true measure of success. Not the termination of Davis Sterling, but the restoration and elevation of the women whose careers he had tried to suppress. I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the full arc of the past 3 years. Davis's casual, entitled dismissal of me, the text message. The attempt to reduce my decades of strategic achievement to a dampening atmosphere had been the single greatest strategic blunder of his life. He had sought to humiliate me publicly, and in doing so, he had activated the full, crushing weight of my resources, leading to his total professional destruction and the profound, transformative empowerment of his ex-wife. Davis Sterling was now a ghost. I knew vaguely, through routine background checks that Jonathan's team performed just to maintain awareness, that Davis had failed to hold down any management positions since the court ruling. His documented history of attempted fraud, ethical violations, and the judge's public commentary had rendered him effectively unemployable in any industry that valued integrity. He was rumored to be drifting between low-level sales roles, perpetually blaming the vindictive corporate conspiracy led by his ex-mother-in-law for his persistent failures. He was entirely irrelevant, trapped in the loop of his own narcissistic denial. I looked at Quinn, the woman who now led a powerful, ethical enterprise built entirely on the principles of accountability Davis had so spectacularly ignored. Davis never understood, Quinn, I said, looking out at the glittering landscape of the city we commanded. That disrespect is only viable when the recipient lacks the power to enforce consequences. His attempt to sideline the woman he perceived as inconvenient only inspired the creation of a system designed specifically to elevate women and systematically sideline men like him. Ego always loses to data, eventually. The office, high in the Atherton Tower, felt purposeful, not just as a center of commerce but as a bastion of rigorous ethical standards. The victory was complete, not because Davis was ruined, but because his failure had birthed a thriving enterprise of integrity. If you found the detailed strategy and ultimate transformation in this story compelling, please make sure to subscribe and like. Your support helps us tell more stories about strategic clarity and uncompromising accountability.